Welcome to Health Action Network Society's webinar series, Thriving Through It. My name is Nada Giesler, and I'm the General Manager of Health Action Network Society, more widely known as HANS. I'm so pleased to introduce our presenters today. We are very fortunate to have Dr. Ray St. Arnault and Colleen Fish share their expertise on the Canadian psychedelic therapy landscape. Dr. Ray is a naturopathic physician practicing in Vancouver, BC, and is the co-founder of Empower Health, a multidisciplinary health clinic that started the first legal interdisciplinary ketamine-assisted therapy program in Canada. A recognized psychedelic industry expert, Dr. St. Arnault has consulted both clinics and professionals on psychedelic protocols, governance, and regulations, and has worked with teams and professionals in the design and implementation of research and clinical protocols with the intention of bringing psychedelic medicine into the mainstream. Oops, hang on here. Colleen Fish has worked in harm reduction, human rights, mental health, and drug policy reform for over 20 years. During the past 8 years, she has worked for Vancouver Coastal Health as a psychiatric worker, detox worker, access referral worker, and research assistant. Colleen first began volunteering with the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies, known as MAPS, in 2011, and did a 5-year internship at the head office in Santa Cruz in 2012. In 2015, she was elected to the MAPS Canada Board of Directors, and where she remains. Dr. Ray and Colleen will take questions after the presentation. When that time comes, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available for viewing on the Health Action Network Society website at hans.org. And welcome, Dr. Ray and Colleen.
Thank you very much, Nada. It's just a pleasure to be here today with all of you. It's a topic near and dear to my heart. But first, before we start, we'd both like to acknowledge the land on which both Colleen and I are situated right now. It's the traditional and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. A presentation about psychedelic medicines, substances would not be complete without acknowledging this, as there are thousands of years of traditional uses of plants and other psychotropic substances, not just psychedelic substances, across the globe. And just a little disclaimer that this presentation in particular does focus on the colonized and medicalized, and it's basically a colonial view of psychedelics, so there's a much more rich history that we don't delve into here, but we want to acknowledge that because there's a lot of people doing really good work in these areas as well. So as mentioned, I'm a naturopathic physician. I have pretty extensive experience in business, organizational, and nonprofit development. I've done a lot of clinical systems design and implementation in both the integrative and psychedelic fields. And I really enjoy working in multiple stakeholder environments and team environments. And I really also am very interested lately in the, in bringing innovative governance models and team-based approaches into both the private and public sectors. So. And prior to this, where my interest in all of this came was through my degree in environmental studies and human geography. So it's really about the human systems that we live in and our interactions with the natural world. And psychedelics is a one of those important topics in that. So I'll hand it over to Colleen to introduce herself, and then we'll get started.
So I am Colleen Fish, and as mentioned, I have been on the board of MAPS Canada for 5 years. I've previously completed a Bachelor of Science and a Bachelor of Arts with a major of anthropology, and then in December, I completed my Master's of Public Policy and Administration with a focus on social change leadership, and my final capstone was on 2 very challenging topics: sexual assault and psychedelic assisted therapy within Canada. So to begin, a breakdown of what we're going to talk about, histories and psychedelics in Prohibition, in Canada, as well as the current regulatory landscape of drugs and substances in Canada, and then specifically recent events in Canada psychedelic therapy landscape, as well as a very brief overview of the research, how training is moving forward, as well as the markets of psychedelics. And then finally, we'll discuss how we move forward.
Sorry, I was muted there. So first we're just going to delve in a little bit into the history of psychedelics and prohibition in Canada. And the best person to explain this between the two of us is Colleen. She's taken a real special interest in this. So take it away, Colleen.
Thanks, Ray.
So
psychedelics really date back in Canada, in Saskatchewan, into the 1950s. It all really began when Dr. Humphrey Osmond, who's a psychiatrist, moved from England to Saskatchewan and began working at Weyburn Clinic, which is pictured there. Things really took off when he partnered with Dr. Abram Hoffer, and they were looking into how to provide treatment for psychosis, which ultimately led them to having an interest in psychedelics, although at that time, that was not what it was called yet. So psychedelic or LSD at the time was easier to obtain than mescaline. So they switched their studies to LSD, and they first gave their LSD doses to 2 patients, 1 male, 1 female, in 1953. They were easily able to obtain the LSD from Sandoz Pharmaceutical Company back, or Canadian branch in Montreal back in the 1950s. So they gave them 200 micrograms, which is a relatively higher dose than the common dose for LSD. And after the study, 1 person quit immediately, while the other one stopped drinking about 6 months later. So, very brief timeline. In 1912, Merck first synthesized Mdma as a byproduct of another chemical reaction. Then in 1938, Albert Hofmann synthesized LSD. However, at this time, he did not know how much it was going to change the world. So the big day, April 19th, which is actually coming up, in 1943, it's called Bicycle Day, because that was the first day that he truly had the effects of the substance and was, well, blown away by his LSD experience as he was riding his bicycle home. So in Canada, as mentioned earlier, the term psychedelic, it wasn't coined until 1956, although it was coined by Dr. Osmond in Saskatchewan. He was writing in response a letter to Aldous Huxley. And then 1958 was the first published 24-patient study that used LSD, although that was not controlled. The first controlled LSD trial was published in 1962. Again, these 2 studies were done in Saskatchewan. And unfortunately, at this point, things began to shift a bit. And in 1966, Sandoz Pharmaceutical Company voluntarily ended their distribution of LSD, which certainly affected how Hoffer and Osmond in Saskatchewan were able to do their research. So this is an example of the very first time it's been documented that the word psychedelic was used. So yeah, this is the official letter with Osmond's writing and everything. Osmond believed that the word psychedelic was to mean mind manifesting. Unfortunately, it is unclear how many people exactly were treated with LSD by Weyburn, or in Weyburn by Osmond and Hoffer, along with some of the other scientists or psychiatrists that were working with psychedelics. But it is evident that both of them came to accept that LSD was helping those suffering from alcohol use disorder, as it became obvious that it helped them stop, it helped them improve their lives. Unfortunately, as mentioned briefly earlier, the research was quickly suppressed, and that included their research. So, of course, Prohibition has basically taken over the world. However, the beginning of Prohibition in Canada began with the Opium Act of 1908. And even though many drugs and substances have been used around the world for thousands of years in traditional manners, including opium, ibogaine, ayahuasca, coca, and many others, this Opium Act was introduced with little concern for that, given it only prohibited the smoking of opium, which was often how Asian men who consumed it, who had immigrated to support the Canadian Railway here in Vancouver. So unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, so with the settler population, aka Western Europeans, they predominantly consumed opium not through smoking, but through tinctures and other forms of consumption, including even using diacetyl morphine, which is aka heroin. So in 1962, LSD was prohibited in Canada. And then internationally, the first convention, so through the United Nations, was introduced in 1971, the Convention of Psychotropic Substances, although that was later replaced with the Convention Against Illicit Traffic in Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances. That's not a mouthful of a title at all. But today, that convention has 87 signatories and 191 parties signed on to it. So, in other words, a lot of countries have signed on to this convention. Of course, in 1976, Mdma was made illegal. Oh, and sorry, I went backwards. 1974, psilocybin, aka mushrooms, was prohibited in Canada, and then Mdma in 1976. Therefore, this regulatory system of categorizing drugs according to medical value and harm has been established, not just in Canada, but throughout most countries, some more than others. And finally, in 1996, the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act replaced the Narcotic Control Act. So, Ray?
Sorry. So the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, the CDSA, which was created in 1996, it is different than the schedules, or it features schedules that are actually different than those in the US. So often media will quote, American policy. So we get a little bit confused. They are similar, but they're definitely different. Our schedules in our Controlled Drugs and Substances Act actually focus on the schedules actually indicate the type of punishment that you get for possessing or manufacturing or selling them. So what I would encourage everybody to do to really understand this is to not listen to us. It's to go read it yourself. It's quite self-explanatory. I've been in this world for a long time now, working toward some form of regulation or legalization or decriminalization. And, when I actually took the time to read the act, I just realized how absolutely barbaric and backwards it was. And, it's just unbelievable how we outline how to punish people, for possessing some of these substances. And I'm not suggesting that some of these things can't do harm to people, but this presentation, we don't have the time, and it's not really the focus of this presentation to go into detail about drug policy reform. There are actually people and organizations that are really focused and dedicated to doing that, but I really do encourage you to look those up. So we are focusing very broadly on this right now, but just to show you where some of the psychedelics are situated in this act, you can see that we have, as far as psychedelics are concerned, ketamine, Mdma, GHB, those are in Schedule 1. We have Schedule 2, which actually used to have cannabis, which is really interesting, and awesomely, it has been removed from the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. So there are some synthetic cannabinoids that are still in there. In Schedule 3, we have LSD, DMT, psilocybin, mescaline, and some other designer ones. You can see 2CB down there as well. And the acts actually go on till about, or sorry, the schedules go on to Schedule 9. And interestingly, Schedule 9 is a newer addition to this act, and it includes pill makers. So pill makers are actually prohibited as well. And that was introduced in order to curb the fentanyl crisis. So you can see that our approach to drug policy in Canada has been more about punishment and criminalization rather than harm reduction. So I definitely encourage everybody to look more into these issues, because it is very relevant to all kinds of health and social issues in this country. So.
Next one. There we go.
And, just to emphasize and just to go back to that timeline that Colleen presented earlier, that the history of psychedelics and drugs in general in Canada and elsewhere in the world is very riddled by, colonial and racist policies. So, and also sexist, of course, too, right? So in medical research is often favored, white males. We just want to take a moment to just acknowledge that there's an entire history of women in psychedelics. This is not, we're not able to get into details about all this stuff, but there are people across Canada and the US and the world who are beginning to, the much needed documentation of the role of women, Indigenous people, people of color, and other minorities in the history of psychedelic medicine. And in some cases, the outright abuse that is riddled throughout these for example, research studies. So even in Canada, a fellow by the name of Ewan Cameron in Montreal provided LSD to patients without consent, along with forcing them to listen to the same phrase over and over again while being restrained for hours and sometimes days. And this research was not surprisingly funded by the CIA. So, you can't really have a discussion about the history of psychedelics without really going into the dark history there as well. So, yeah.
So briefly, the regulatory landscape of drugs and substances in Canada.
Yeah, so we just wanted to give a little bit of context into regulation. Again, we will not be able to do this topic full justice, but we just wanted to pull up this graph, which kind of outlines the extremes of regulation, like the two extremes of regulation that you can have. So you can have on the left-hand side, all the way over to prohibition, where you don't, and you've got lots of evidence in history of, alcohol being prohibited and all kinds of things being prohibited, right over to the other end of the spectrum, which is, full legalization with few restrictions, which you end up getting more of a corporate profit or more profit into the corporate side of things rather than the illegal side of things. So what's the best way of doing things? Again, a lot of this is theoretical. There are some examples around the world of where they have more moderate approaches that we can look at. And you can kind of see in the middle, this graph really favors a more public health approach with some market regulation. You might have some medicalization, some legalization. You also would have some decriminalization. So yeah, when you look at this graph, you can see like where are things now. You can see that things like heroin and cocaine and methamphetamine are on way over to the left. And that also includes what we're not seeing here, all those other psychedelics that we saw in those schedules 1, 2, and 3. And then you've got things that are socially or considered socially acceptable psychotropic substances, which are alcohol and tobacco. And just to show you how not scientifically based these forms of regulation are, if we go to the next slide, we'll see that in actual, order of harm that these substances can do. This was a study done by Nutt in 2010 in England. you actually see alcohol is actually to the far left of the spectrum of drugs in terms of the harms that it can do to both yourself and others. And way down at the other end of the spectrum, you have things like mushrooms and LSD and MDMA. So, whether or not this is, this isn't, hard cold fact, but certainly it does reflect that our drug policies are not really based in reality, but rather based in whatever the political milieu of the day was when they were created. So we're now going to go into some recent events in the Canadian psychedelic therapy landscape. So lots has happened, unless you're not watching the news or on social media or talking to anybody, you probably know that cannabis has been legalized in Canada. It has set a precedent across the globe. We're not going to get into too many details about cannabis in this presentation. Some people classify it as a psychedelic, some people don't. It definitely is a mind-altering substances, and I think we can, say that, all of these things should be considered in similar ways, or approached in similar ways, as far as, there's not really a ethical, moral difference between, cannabis versus a psychedelic, although psychedelics are really popular right now. So cannabis, whether the way it was legalized is the best way it could be legalized or not is up for debate. Certainly, there's a lot of critiques of the way it was legalized, and there are still quite a few ways that you, can be punished, for cannabis if it's not done in a, the way that the government's outlined it. So after that happened, a lot of people in that sphere who are advocating for cannabis really thought that it would be the sort of the gateway into legalizing or regulating other substances. And sure enough, we are seeing some political will moving in that direction. In 2019, we saw a similar boom of illegal online and storefront dispensaries opening up for psilocybin mushrooms. There's pretty much countless places that you can get these things now. Just to be clear, these are not actually legalized. We just have a political climate where different jurisdictions are deprioritizing their whether it's arrests or punishments for these things. So it doesn't mean that they're legal. It just means that they're easier to access and you're less likely to get in trouble for it. So in August 2020, we actually had 4 patients given Section 56 exemptions. So remembering the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, the CDSA that we talked about earlier, there is a section, it's Section 56. It's very easy to find online. You can read it. We've also copied it a little bit down below here, where the Minister of Health can grant exceptions to patients or I think it's patients or entities to use these substances for medical or scientific purposes. So for medical or for the public interest, right? So we had 4 patients. It was a program that I guess it was, how long was it, Colleen? Like a year and a half that Therasil was advocating for this or more. Oh, you're muted.
It was from like January 2017 or June 2017.
Yeah.
2017, no.
Yeah,
it's been a while.
Therasil is a nonprofit organization that was basically lobbying the federal government and the minister to grant these exemptions for end of life care. And now we've seen it moving into other directions. So there's actually, I don't know how many patients so far have received these exemptions, but it's definitely been a very interesting progression in history for Canada. The problem with this is that the Minister of Health individually accepts each of these. So this is not a sustainable way of accessing psychedelics. In August of 2020, the Prime Minister Justin Trudeau also instructed prosecutors to stop pressing charges for uncomplicated possession of any drug. So that also added to the easier ability to access these things. Then in September 2020, a petition was delivered by Paul Manley. It was initiated by Decriminalize Nature to Parliament to decriminalize psychedelics or plant medicines. And then in November of 2020, the Vancouver City Hall, and I'm not sure if other cities across Canada have done this as well, but it's worth looking into, also unanimously endorsed the decriminalization of all drugs. And Vancouver is, this stuff is always very present for us here due to the well-known neighborhood called the Downtown East Side. I live very close to it here in Vancouver. It's the source of a lot of, political debate here in the city. And yeah, so, the topic of decriminalization of drugs is a pretty hot topic here these days. So Vancouver, I think this is obviously a great move by Vancouver City Hall. And again, they don't actually have any power to change the federal criminal laws, but I think it's definitely a move in the right direction as far as putting some political pressure onto the federal government. So a little brief history there. And then I think on the next slide, so other things that happened recently. So ketamine is a lesser known psychedelic. It's psychedelic in higher doses. It's definitely known as a party drug or a street drug. In higher doses that can be used as a psychedelic. While this particular use, this is a medical use where it's been approved for use by psychiatrists and physicians who are approved for major depressive disorder. It's in a much lower intranasal dose, but that was approved in Canada in July 2020. Just to be clear, ketamine is, while it is a controlled substance, it does have medical use and is used widely in anesthesia. And that's aside from major depression, in this case, it is only approved for use in anesthesia. Everything else is off label. And then in December 2020, Health Canada, so it's very recently, announced its intent to amend the Food and Drug Act. This is the Special Access Program. Is this right, Colleen? They're amending the.
No, it's for the. So of course, technically, even if you get this Section 56 exemption for psilocybin, it's still illegal. So they're trying to amend the Food and Drug Regulations Act to be able to actually have psilocybin available legally. Right. So it would be more like a prescription. Yeah. So unfortunately, psychedelics are still not included or do not qualify for exemption. And this is where we'll get into the special access program. And then just lastly, the February of this year, so a couple months ago, the BC government moved to decriminalize small amounts of possession of illicit drugs for personal use. So go to the next slide. I'll hand this over to Colleen. She's going to just give a brief overview of the research, training, and the capital markets and how they're influencing the psychedelic landscape here in Canada. All right. Now, when we say small sample of psychedelic studies, this is probably just a tiny little pinch of what's actually available out there. And this list is in no way chronological or rated according to importance. All of this has been incredibly important in the way that psychedelics have moved forward in the last 10 years. Mm-hmm. So Johns Hopkins ended up completing a phase 2 clinical trial with psilocybin for end-of-life anxiety with very positive results. MAPS United States, Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies, they completed their phase 2 study with MDMA for the treatment of PTSD, and now are beginning their phase 3 clinical trials for MDMA here in Vancouver, including, I believe, 12 other sites around the world, including even Israel. The Imperial College has completed some of the most advanced imaging done with LSD and the effects that it had on the brain. They actually used 3 types of neuroimaging and put it all together. And of course, it really showed that the brain lit up. Bristol and Imperial recently completed a study involving MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for the treatment of alcohol use disorders, again, with more positive results. A current study taking place right now, and if you actually have an interest and you are microdosing, although they also want non-microdosing people, It's just an app through Quantified Citizen that tracks, like asks questions, asks surveys. Apparently, it's going to be one of the largest studies ever done on microdosing, and hopefully pending approval through the University of Ottawa with Monica Williams, they'll be doing the first interdisciplinary study designed to explore the qualitative dimensions of psychedelic experiences. And of course, so far, most of the research, if not 99% of it, 98% of it, has been on quantitative research. So, you know, scales of depression, scales of anxiety, scales of PTSD. Do people improve in these scales? However, there's really very little looking at the experience, the lived experience of the individuals experiencing psychedelics. So that's going to be a pretty big development. This is just a very, very, like a picture, a snapshot, that's the word I'm looking for, of some psychedelic training, therapy training that exists. So MDMA or MAPS is in the United States, and the training is through the United States. However, that training is available to Canadians. There is SIL, which was already mentioned. They also have a training program, and that is in Canada. And I just discovered today, apparently the Justice Institute of British Columbia out in New Westminster has a psychedelic therapy course where you can learn about psychedelics. So I thought that was pretty exciting. Their training centers all over Canada are opening up. And honestly, it's probably a good thing because we're going to need a lot of trained therapists in psychedelics. Now, this is a list. Don't try reading it all. I don't expect that. But it is an example of the number of companies and the value that they are, that they hold, both public and private. In total, there were 95 companies listed. All involving somehow psychedelics. Unfortunately, I do believe that we've kind of seen a lot of for-profit companies in the past claiming that they have the solution. So we are needing a solution to the mental health crisis. I know, as being a person who's worked in mental health for a long time, we've been in a mental health crisis for a very long time, with inefficient treatments, inefficient systems. I lost my train of thought, but yeah, so we're moving forward. Lots of companies are starting up. There's probably new startups almost every day, all over the world, not just in Canada. Of course, some places are a lot more strict regarding psychedelics. Canada has been very progressive, so let's hope we keep being progressive. Mm-hmm. So what is the way forward then?
Yeah, so we've just given a pretty surface and broad overview of just sort of the history of the psychedelic landscape in Canada, and we've touched a little bit on what's going on in the rest of the world. That we've sort of talked about training programs and research and all these things. Some of the takeaway messages here are, these things, there's even though it looks like there's a lot of activity in relation to psychedelics, there's, labs popping up, manufacturing facilities, training programs, all of the success of all of these companies and all of these initiatives does depend on regulatory changes, which have not fully happened right now. So the real question right now is, where is it going to go? And so we can look at things that have happened in the past. You can look at examples in corporate healthcare. You can look at pharmaceutical industries and product developments. You can look at the cannabis, like what happened with cannabis. And so you can start to sort of understand that, you do some if this then that's, and you can look at it, but really we don't know. We actually don't know what's going to happen in the next few years. Some people predict that these things are going to be legal a lot quicker. Other people say that we're 3 to 5 years off of any kind of major progress in this area, but certainly the amount of money being invested in this space is definitely pushing things in a certain direction. So we do have an opportunity right now as a country, as provinces, as cities and communities, to really start to think about the way that we would like things to go and what are some of the promises and pitfalls of the different models being presented. I have quite a bit of experience in the for-profit healthcare realm, being a naturopathic doctor, but there are lots of regulations in terms of how those things are carried out. We haven't really seen sort of the level of corporate involvement in healthcare that we're starting to see happen across the country right now, not just in psychedelics, but other sort of big companies and more tech-based platforms for health. So this slide is kind of a let's throw everything on there. And as far as topics that could be covered, probably an entire weekend courses on their own. But one of the takeaway messages here is to really see, if we really zoom out, the way that we've approached, where the common discourse in psychedelics is right now is in this very psychiatric, psychological, psychotherapeutic, therapy-based model, which is really focusing on the individual, quote unquote, treatment of people. We all know that substances, not just recreationally, but also traditionally, have been used all over the world. And in many cases, in traditional cultures, are used in more community or social settings. And so one of the questions or the things that we would like people to think about is just, rather than focusing on psychedelics as a individual, healing tool, how can they be used as social or cultural healing tools as well? So, that's sort of one of the questions that keep coming up for us is that as we see this, we really are, as we drive forward with trying to amend Controlled Substances and Drug Act, do we want all these things to be prescription medications and only available inside of a doctor's office? Or, do we want more regulation like what alcohol looks like? And, these are really things that we need to look at. And I'm sure you have a lot to add here too, Colleen.
Mm-hmm. It's funny. You did sum that up pretty well. However, so in my capstone, in my final, I am unmuted, right? Why did that flash up? Yeah, I completed a research into sexual assault and psychedelic assisted therapy, and it wasn't using psychedelic assisted therapy for the treatment of sexual assault, but rather the people providing it end up doing some very unethical things with their patients. And I found while I was doing this paper that we often think of set and setting in terms of the individual. So set and setting, of course, that phrase was termed back by Timothy Leary in the 1960s, I believe. Set refers to the individual, whereas setting, it refers to the relationship of the people that are around them, how many people are around them. What's their physical environment like? What type of music is being played? How is the role of the guide fitting in? So of course, if you're receiving ayahuasca therapy, it's probably going to be quite a bit different from MDMA therapy. And of course, the training behind that and the understanding of the worldview, it shifts. So in many ways, I kind of thought, the psychedelic therapy community itself, or the world, or the approach, it is in itself also a set and setting. It has its own belief systems. It has its own ways of working and moving through the world. I hope that made sense. But really, so of course, the setting for the Canadian psychedelic therapy currently is that it is illegal. It is prohibited. It is said that there's no medical value. Now, of course, people in the psychedelic community have seen research for the past 15, 20 years that shows the complete opposite. However, that it actually is good. But because of this general world discourse that we live in of, taking drugs is bad for you. You can't take drugs that make you feel good. There's a lot of,
not a favorable setting.
Exactly. Like, yeah, so we really got to work at getting away from that, and prohibition, and it doesn't work. However, does really complete medicalization of it work either?
Well, that's
there's
a
lot
setting
of
too,
people,
right? That's a setting too, right? The medical setting, so we're replacing one setting for another. So we're replacing an illegal underground market within, like we showed earlier, with an above ground market. And this is where we get into issues. We get into the issues facing medicine in general these days, and this is issues of diversity and equity. I mean, issues of digital surveillance, issues of IP issues around pharmaceutical drugs and cost of drugs, and public versus private health problems, and it really is a whole other can of worms that we're getting into when we actually legalize these things. So yeah, we just want to leave this presentation with more, there should be more questions and answers after you watch this presentation. So I think we're probably, I think we're at time here. We just want to thank everybody for tuning in today. And if you guys would like references or more information, that certainly you can contact us. If you want to contact Hans, I'm happy to share with you my contact. I'm sure Colleen would be too. I think you're muted.
Oh, no, I was whispering.
Oh, sorry.
Honestly, I'm sorry. I screwed up this slide. There was some outdated information on it that was no longer correct. And so I tried to take a picture of it, but I cut out the website for Hans, and now I feel awful. However, they are on social, so you can totally find them there.
Yeah. So yeah,
we have time to take a few questions, ladies.
Of course.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So if anybody has questions, and I'm sure some of you do, use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen, and I will pass your questions along to Colleen and Dr. Ray.
I have lots of questions. I just don't have anybody necessarily who can answer for them for me today. We had to do some, a lot of, I thought I knew a lot about psychedelics, having been involved with them for so long. And, it's kind of the water, the pool ocean that I'm swimming in right now. But it's amazing some of the stuff that we discovered while researching this. So.
Okay, so we have one I've heard. Hang on here, I'm just going to pull this totally up. Oops.
I'm seeing one in the chat here that I think would be a good one to answer.
Yeah. So I've heard
that
the BC College has blocked physicians from using ketamine off-label for depression. Is this the case?
I'm also one of the co-founders of the Ketamine Assisted Therapy Association of Canada. It formerly was CAT-BC. And so I do know a lot about this topic. And it's, so blocking is not necessarily the right way of describing what's going on. It's the regulations are currently under review, and the previous regulations are actually very ambiguous. So medical regulations are, whether it's naturopathic or standard medical or whatever, laws in general, they're just, the legalese is really hard to understand. And actually I have some psychiatrist friends who are, longtime, legal prescribers of ketamine who actually couldn't understand the regulations themselves. So basically prior to mid last year, you were able to use ketamine off-label for depressions. This is probably where the question's originating from. In the fall, they came out with a regulation that looked like it prohibited it, but there was definitely ambiguity around it. And now there's another regulation on the table that's under review by the College of Physicians right now that would further restrict the use in an out of a hospital setting. But the college has put it out for review, and the results of the review process are not yet published yet. So it's a bit complicated because technically, if you did prescribe it as a physician right now, it's not totally, according to the wording, depending on the circumstance, not legal or permissible, but just the risk of doing it and being, you know, getting potentially punished by your college is still there. So, yeah, it is definitely a complicated issue. I would recommend you to go to the CATA Canada website, KATA Canada.org, which is the Ketamine Assisted Therapy Association of Canada website, and sign up for the newsletter. We are definitely going to be providing more public resources as we get more information on this as we go. So we will hopefully be able to update people more on things more currently as they come out. So good question.
Excellent, thank you. Question about MDMA. Is vertigo a common side effect after the experience? And how does it affect the immune system?
Do you want me to tackle that one, Colleen? Or?
Oh, go ahead.
I don't know if it's a listed side effect of MDMA or a commonly known side effect of MDMA. I think with this kind of mind-altering substance and the intense alteration of the nervous system that it has, I am sure that some people can probably experience vertigo on it. I just don't know how common it would be. As far as how it affects the immune system, so this, I could probably nerd out on a topic like this for hours, but it doesn't necessarily directly impact the immune system, but depending on the physiological conditions of the body and your genetic conditions, it is definitely using up a lot of what we call glutathione. It's the thiol system, or the endogenous antioxidant system of the body, because it puts a lot of pressure on your nerves and your neurons and your synapses. So chronic use in a person who has potentially more susceptibility or is not ingesting cofactors to replace, it can be definitely neurotoxic and also toxic on the kidneys, and it over time would deplete your probably your glutathione in the body, which would indirectly impact your nervous system. The other piece to this is it's a stimulant. It's related. It's related to it has a close resemblance to methamphetamine, and it actually stimulates you. So when you're doing this stuff, or people are doing this stuff at night and not sleeping, it can definitely, you know, the lack of sleep and stimulation can actually impact the immune system as well. But it doesn't necessarily, you know, directly impact the immune system. Although, you know, again, because these things are illegal, the studies, the amount of studies that a lot of other medications would have that would show both the good and the bad. So this is another problem with having these things be illegal, is that, you know, it's not just positive things that we want to see from these things. We want to see the research that shows the negative. There's no substance that you can use in any amount that won't have both positive and negative effects. And so when you make these things illegal, then you don't get just a lot of general health research done on these things. And I actually do think MDMA, despite people loving this stuff and despite psychedelic enthusiasts loving this substance, it can be really hard on the system, right? And so we actually don't know what the sort of full effects of some of these drugs are on people. So
makes sense. Thank you. Comment and a question here. Very interesting and rich to see the threads in the historical development. What stands out from this perspective is that how decisions and changes are made on top of what are already problematic regulations and politics. If you had a blank slate and a magic wand, what would you wish for?
Wow, man, I think, you know, for me, what I would wish for is the people that I know who are really, you know, adept in these areas is for regulation, like the Canadian Drug Policy Coalition and others. I wish that governments would just listen to them. You know, I can't, you know, I am somewhat of a policy expert on these things, but not to the degree, more than the average human, but definitely not to the degree that some people are studying them. But I would love to hear Colleen's take on this. She definitely knows more about it than I do.
Well, so of course, included in that question was if I had a magic wand and I could do whatever I wanted. To be honest, I actually think that I would just strike the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act completely. And I think society, humanity, people who are in marginalized and vulnerable communities, they would instantly be better off and they would instantly be safer. The prohibition just, how can you fix such a broken system without completely dismantling it and building it up from the top again? And unfortunately, so of course I am part of MAPS Canada, and our goal is to medicalize MDMA. And I do feel very strongly that people need to have that clean, safe, regulated access. However, you know, as with other psychedelics as well, it completely cuts out people who may want to use it for spiritual growth, or using MDMA to help repair a relationship that's near divorce. That's, you know, not a medical reason. So I would say those were probably my two big things: is just get rid of it completely, or at least, I mean, yeah, the next step, unfortunately, to help the most people that really need it the most, the fastest, would be to medicalize it. But if I really had that magic wand, yeah, I'd restart the whole thing. I'd go back in time and prevent it from being made illegal in the first place. Yeah. Oh, wouldn't that be great? Hey, you said a magic wand.
Yeah, I have to say I 100% agree with that. And I you know, I am in the regulated healthcare field, and I see this with a lot of things. It's not just psychedelics, but it's everything from high dose vitamin D and high dose vitamin C, where I am a gatekeeper for these therapies for people. And, you know, I do operate within my scope of practice. Like I don't work outside of that. And at the same time, my own personal views around personal freedom, personal healthcare freedom, just personal freedom in general, is I have a more positive outlook on the human condition. I do think that people are capable of regulating themselves. I think we treat people like children. Does it mean there aren't nuances in that? Of course, but I do think that there's a bit of a territoriality with both physicians, naturopaths, even in, you'd think that naturopathic doctors would be, more progressive in these areas as well. And we span across a whole spectrum, but, you get a certain group of people that really likes to have, control over other people's choices, and, the law enforcement system. So, the cool part is you can go to jurisdictions where they, have loosened up laws, and for the most part, it's been, very positive. So yeah, or positive impacts on society and addiction and all kinds of things. So.
Thank you. We have a few questions. Could you speak a bit about the absurd push to patent psychedelic therapy going on now, mostly in the States, and how this is affecting the process towards decriminalization and or legalization in Canada?
Yeah, I'd love to answer that a little bit. I just posted a link into that answer. I don't know if people see it or not, but I can also post it later. But I do encourage people to really look up the impact of IP and innovation. A lot of the defenses around IP and why it was created, if you really, again, do your research and go to evidence, it does not, it's designed to sort of promote innovation. That's the sort of defense of it. But in reality, when you really look at the impact of intellectual property, is it ends up favoring, through the legal systems and the political systems and the capitalist systems that are in play, it does end up favoring monopolies and big time players. And so if we did have a fair playing field where the little guys, little IP, projects were also as promoted and protected, I think you might have something different. It's just that the bigger systems that are at play don't result in better outcomes for society, even from a capitalist perspective, like in terms of free, healthy competition, right? You don't really get that. So there are companies both in Canada and in the US who are going for patents, and I think that they should all be questioned. So it's not a point blank, you shouldn't patent something or not have intellectual property. It's not just patents, it's intellectual property, it's knowledge, it's copyright materials. it's a pretty big debate in the psychedelic world in general right now too. So, but yeah, there are ways of doing business and disrupting the intellectual property and patent trends out there. So, yeah.
Thank you.
And can I add something?
Yeah.
Of course. I mean, all of the psychedelics that we've spoken about today, they technically can't be patented.
Mm-hmm.
And honestly, in my view, it's like, why break, or what does that say? Don't break what's like already fixed. They're good the way they are. Do we really want to change LSD to be some other chemical? Is it going to even be the same thing? There's I mean, maybe we can extract psilocybin in a more efficient way, but again, just like with cannabis, they attempted to extract and prescribe THC, but only THC without all of the other cannabinoids. There's a reason why we use the cannabis plant as a whole versus, taking out the psilocybin. What about all the other chemicals that might actually have some kind of impact on the therapy for that individual that we're not even aware of yet? So if we only take out the psilocybin, are we using the plants to what they really should be used for? Or are we just trying to patent it to make some more money and cut out a bunch of people? Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's an area that I have a lot of. I come from I really want community healing instead of these so-called control over knowledge that has really continued on for hundreds of years.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I think we'll take one more, and then I have a question. But from an anonymous attendee, as a psychotherapist outside of training, what are some good ways to start getting involved in psychedelic-assisted therapy now?
Well, like we said earlier, there are two sort of major training programs in development or available in Canada. There's the MAPS USA training, as well as there is Therasil, which is just launching their training. There's other sort of trainings across Canada that are, so, just because somebody's training for psychedelics, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be something approved or somehow in a regulatory environment. There's psychedelic societies and clubs and organizations, across Canada. So certainly, again, what I'm kind of seeing is that they're just with the amount of questions that are here, it might be good to compile them afterwards and somehow we can get those answers for you. Again, the only way to do it right now, outside of these, whether it's special access, not special access, Section 56 exemptions, ketamine inside of a doctor's office, there's no legal way of doing it. Does it mean it's not happening? No, there are hundreds of psychedelic therapists across Canada, and there are, I don't like the word underground, but there are some, not sort of, more high profile training programs that you can do to get training in this stuff. And so again, I personally, as a professional, can't endorse them or recommend them, but you can certainly look them up and vet them for yourselves. But yeah, it's happening. So regardless of whether they're legal or not, it's happening. People are accessing this stuff. So, and there are ways of finding this information out.
So I have a pretty basic question. And I don't know how comfortable you're going to be answering it, but I'll give it a go. So if I was interested in, if I had some unresolved trauma that I thought could be remedied with psychedelic therapy, where would you recommend that I start? And I do know there are places to start, but where do you get the actual psychedelic? Is there a safe source of that? So where would I go if I wanted to access the therapy and also the substance?
Yeah. Do you want to try answering that first, Colleen? I can certainly also.
Sure. I've answered this question many, many times over the years of working with MAPS Canada. And technically, the only way you can truly legally access psychedelic therapy in Canada is through research. Now, of course, because ketamine it is allowed through like medical prescription with a doctor. There are some sites in Canada that I believe it costs, I knew this. I think it's $3,500 a session or something like that for the legal ketamine. There's a clinic that's going to be, are they open in Toronto yet, or are they opening soon?
There are clinics, some clinics that are open. It's not,
yeah.
It's either sublingual or intranasal use. So it's a lower dose therapy, but yeah, the intramuscular use of ketamine, which is the more psychedelic dose of ketamine, was made less legal.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like there's really only more legal and less legal. It's the terminology gets a bit confusing. I think the question though for you personally, so again, this is a webinar that's being recorded. So, for Colleen and I, it's just, we just cannot give recommendations of where to access these things. But I just will say, it is not hard to find, so I think this is where we get into, the changing political landscape right now. And it's what happened with cannabis. Like before it was legal, you could buy it in a store. So it's almost like, well, what does even the word legal mean? Like if you don't have enforcement, right? So now we're seeing, you can literally order psilocybin online. There's a storefront on Hastings, like 2 blocks from my house here, where you can walk in and get it. It's very easy to access. As a naturopathic physician or a healthcare provider, I do have people ask me about this stuff all the time. And so what my line with people is look, like, you're going to access this stuff from a harm reduction perspective. I'm going to make sure that you're healthy, that you kind of know what you're getting into. I won't recommend this stuff to you, but before and after, I've dealt a lot with people before and after these experiences. And so, what you really want to make sure is no matter what you're doing, you have the support of people that know what they're doing. And and that again includes before you do whatever substance, during whatever substance you're doing, and after that. These things are no joke. Like they are, the whole mind manifesting definition of psychedelics is, possibly an understatement. And I've actually dealt with some patients who have had things like psychotic breaks after taking psychedelics. And there are, some people are more susceptible than others. And so it's not a reason to fear. More people die of Tylenol, liver failure from Tylenol than ever in the history of using psychedelics, I'm sure. So, our perception of risk is a little bit off with these things. Does it mean they don't have risk? No. So you definitely want to make sure that you're informed and have support.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Sorry,
Colleen, go ahead.
Can I just add? Without the psychedelic substance present, there are what are called psychedelic integration therapists. So they aren't the ones that actually give you the psychedelic, but if you end up doing it on your own or with a friend, and you end up having something come up that you are really struggling with, you can't process it, there are people that advertise for that psychedelic integration, but it's not the actual psychedelic assisted therapy, if that made sense. Yeah, there's a bit of a difference.
Yep. Excellent. So if anybody, we have some outstanding questions, please feel free to contact me at info@hans.org, and I will send the questions to Colleen or Dr. Ray.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thank you so much. This is such an exciting frontier, and hopefully it will go forward in the way that it should. And just so grateful to have both of you here today. Thank you very, very much.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. And, this topic is only going to continue to evolve over the next several months and years. So yeah, happy to be in contact with anybody. And also if there's anything that was inaccurate on what we said, I mean, there's so much to cover. Any feedback on the presentation is also great, because we hope to obviously, inform and present and enlighten as many audiences as we can around this stuff and get people informed. So thank you so much for having us. It's
You're
wonderful.
very welcome.
Thank you. It was wonderful being here.
So good to have you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for participating, and we'll see you next time. Take care.
Yeah.